podcasts are about power. The power to define and the power to decide. From protests to power gain, we welcome you to our fight for political and economic freedoms here in America. We're almost there. Welcome to this week's episode.
We've been doing a number of these podcasts, and I believe this is our third one. And one of the things we wanted to do as we did these podcasts over time was to begin conversations with younger people, because many of us have been out there for, as I said earlier in earlier podcasts, maybe over 60 years. But our responsibility is to talk to the people who are now in the field. And one of the things that we're trying to do is begin to bring in various people, young people in particular, from various walks of life, people who on a day-to-day engage in some action trying to make life better for the Black community. Some of them involved, again, the first podcast we saw people who involved politically. There's in other podcasts, we'll see people who are involved educationally. We'll see people who are involved in various other parts of life, including science and so forth. But the one thing that all the young people we're going to be talking to over these various podcasts are they're active, they're people who want to be engaged, and they're in conversations with various people throughout the United States. So, I mean, they're just not in a small community of people who are really trying to make a difference. And I have two people here whose responsibility is very big. Uh, First, we have Wisdom Cole, who is the director of the NAACP Youth in College, and then Amari Fennoy, who is also involved in that same work, but engaged in trying to talk to kids, young people, I say kids, but young people. I'm assuming, well, Wisdom, why don't you tell me the range of people that you deal with and what are your responsibilities as you talk to them?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one, thank you so much, Courtland, for inviting me to this podcast. Really enjoy the conversations that we've had over the years. But under the leadership of the NAACP Youth and College Division, we serve about 30,000 members who are under the age of 25 who are engaged in the fight for civil rights. That means building, training, organizing, making sure that leaders have the resources to address the issues that are happening on the local, state, and the national level. You know, something that I wholeheartedly believe is that the local victories inform the national narratives. And so really working with our youth and college leaders, we really want them to own their city, own their state, really work to address key policy concerns, everything from student debt to gun violence to voting rights, and making sure that they know exactly how to address that in a way that is most meaningful to them.
So, uh, when you look at the age range, you say it's under 25. Are most of them in college? Are most of them, going to be professionals? Are most of them going to be work? I mean, give me a profile of some of the young people that you're dealing with.
Yeah, it's actually funny. Most of them are under the age of 18. Actually, most of them are in high school. Most of them are in youth councils. Most of them are young people. When we think about the legacy of the NAACP, 115 years, right? A lot of the young people that I end up coming across are people who are the grandchildren of civil rights leaders, of people who participated in the civil rights movement, and tagged along with their auntie or uncle or grandma or grandpa or mom and dad to the NAACP meeting and was like, hey, you should be a part of this youth council. You should engage in this way. And so, what I've seen across my time in the association is that we have a lot of young people. We do have a lot of people who are in that college age and are trying to figure out how to use the organization to understand the political landscape, right? These are people who are going to be future judges, future lawyers, future policymakers, policy wonks, and folks who want to be able to use their degree or use their passion to cause change. And so a lot of what we do is really setting the groundwork for young leaders to take on this as a career as well. And so part of what we try to do is really make sure that young people have the opportunity to experience all facets of that life.
So, Amari, I met you 2 years ago. You weren't doing this kind of work. You were in the street trying to get young people. I think it was Morehouse and Spelman and young people there to try to get them to vote in the 2022 election, which was really important because it made what we have in the Senate today. So, and you're even younger than Wisdom. So,
Yeah.
so tell me, when you were doing the political organizing at Morehouse and trying to get those young people involved, what was the experience? Tell us what the experience was like, and give us a sense of, the energy that they had or lack of energy that they had.
So for me, working in Georgia, especially when it came to the 2022 election, we found that we already are the individuals who are really moving and shaking and making sure that the work is getting done. So we actually toured more than just the AUC. The AUC is just home for me. I attended Spelman. But of course, we went to rural areas within Georgia as well. We actually visited 36 campuses on a two-leg tour where we actually went to each of the campuses, community colleges as well, to get individuals registered. And what we did, we brought booths, DJ booths, we brought photo booths, but we brought things that would pull them in, and we had those conversations with them to figure out, how exactly do we get them to the polls, but also get them the information needed to educate them when it comes to the ballot. And what we found is they were appreciative of us being there, and they were appreciative to see a familiar face because, of course, I led the youth in college previously, so they were more inclined to participate. But one thing that they did share is they're tired of individuals just coming to campus when it's time to vote, or they're tired of people coming to them when it's when they need them to act or do something. So for them, it was nice to see a familiar face that had been around year round to help support them, to educate them, to also help build and support with resources how to make their decisions. They really engaged and they were active. I think the voter turnout on each of those campuses increased significantly throughout. I don't have the data in front of me, but we did see a huge number of our youth actually turning out to vote, especially within the AUC. There was a huge increase that they hadn't seen since 2019, 2018.
So, given what you just said, Mari, what do you see is happening now on college campuses? Is it sufficient? What else needs to be done? Not only the NAACP, but all the people who are concerned about making sure that we get out to vote. When we're talking about the youth vote, what's your? I mean, I think you made a very important point that people want a relationship, not a transaction. I mean, and basically what you find is people coming, around the time election time, saying, "Vote for me, and I'll set you free." But now what? In 20, I mean, so they've seen that, and they've seen that movie a lot of times. As you talk to people about the 2024 election, what do you hear? What do you see? Uh, are they? Is it too much transactional? Are they relationships that we can build on? I mean, what's your sense of the lay of the land?
Right now there are a lot of transactional relationships. They see a lot of groups that come on campus, as you said, when they need them to do something, when they need to act, because they know that the youth actually push out any activation. We've seen them mobilizing on their campuses. We've seen on TV how they're actually standing up for what they believe in, but we hear a lot of frustration on their end. When we talk about even building those relationships, a lot of trust has been lost in terms of promises being made or certain things that kind of they felt as if should happen within these last couple of years. They're frustrated, and we've actually heard from some of them where it was kind of like misdirected anger, to where it was like, okay, how do we take this anger or this frustration, and how do we use it for the better? How do we actually mobilize individuals towards this issue, and actually having that direct conversation? Our youth, when this last weekend we had a 3-day summit where actually our youth leaders, we had 31 of them, where the requirement was for them to get 50 volunteers. And it was difficult for some of them. Some of them had an increase in volunteers because they talked about the issues happening within their campuses. They also talk about relationships, but some of them had a really hard time because people have a distrust. Why would I help support when it came to phone banking and text banking, when it comes to presidential election, when promises made to me have not been fulfilled or trust has been lost in the system? So for us, it's like we have to rebuild their trust within democracy, but also understanding the power and their agency within this space.
Now, Wisdom, given what Amari just said, I mean, it seems to me, how do we, as you begin to think about NAACP Youth in College, or even any of the organizations, let's say SNCC Legacy Project, any organizations, how do we now begin to really focus and emphasize that we're not just engaged, we want to move beyond transactions? How do we, what is the best path in terms of building a relationship and continuing the relationship so people are involved in political engagement and not just voting? Because vote is just a single act. Political engagement, I mean, how do we now begin to increase political engagement through the various kinds of relationships that Amari talked about?
Yeah, I think it's really about speaking and providing services to the issues that matter the most to young people. Oftentimes we get into this space where we're just focused on voting, or we have to turn out just because we have to do that. And that messaging isn't working, right? I remember back in the day, even as a kid, hearing the vote or die messaging. And that just wasn't working or connecting or resonating with myself or others, right? I recognize, working at a legacy civil rights organization, everything that my ancestors have done for me to be in this place. But to be frank, the world has changed significantly, right? We just went through a global pandemic, and we are still trying to figure out our pathway forward. And there's so many critical issues that are still impacting us. The NAACP has been spearheading and working on a lot of the work to cancel student debt, but even myself as a key negotiator at the table was not able to be able to get debt cancellation for young people, right? That is still an issue that is on the table. There's issues around police violence, around gun violence, that still need to be addressed. Environmental justice, right? We've seen the most or the highest investment into climate justice ever. But when it's looking at opportunities for people of color to enter into those spaces, they're not allowed. And so we have to really make sure that we are training and developing and organizing multidisciplinary issue organizers who are able to galvanize not just their local community, but to impact their state. And so, what's really important in this moment in time is that young people see micro influencers, right? People who can relate to them, people who can speak to them, people who can connect with them, people who aren't just there for a moment, but there for an entire movement.
Yeah. So, Amari, one of the things that is very clear. I mean, one of the things as I was coming up and involved in the early 50s, early 60s, and so forth, people didn't talk about such things as environmental justice or some of the other things that wisdom just talked about. So my sense is, as you talk to young people, their interest seems to be fairly broad, much broader than we could have possibly thought about. I mean, are there some interesting areas that people are active in trying to make better, that's probably new and interesting, that we may not have done anything in that area before?
I think in terms of new and interesting, yes, especially when it comes to the economic piece of it. Wisdom, like he mentioned climate change. That is a racial justice issue. We talk about Cancer Alley in Louisiana. We talk about various different aspects within Georgia. There's several issues that impact Flint when it comes to the water crisis. 10 years now without water. Those issues were present in the past, but as of right now, I think the difference between us and amplifying issues, yes, we do have a broader range, but yes, I think we have different tools to express or push forth the information or the issues that we currently have. So now it seems broader. Or also when it comes to access to resources, I think we just have a better reach, or not a better reach, but we have different tools of communication for us to kind of like amplify those issues. I don't think they're necessarily new. I think they're just more so evolved, or have maybe like shifted in a sense in terms of our issues of what happened in the past.
So, so now the wisdom, now on the question of foreign policy, on the white campuses across the country, you had a big issue on the question of the treatment of Palestinian people. Was that reflected much at HBCUs, or it was there seemed to be a divide, or it's just saying the intensity any different, or it's just the same?
Absolutely. President Biden just spoke this weekend at Morehouse College, and the students and the staff and the parents and the faculty were very divided about having President Biden come to speak at Morehouse. Many students at Morehouse expressed their discontent because of the lack of inaction around the war in Gaza and the consistent support to Israel. And so, even though President Biden, in his speech acknowledged the need for a ceasefire, the question still remains: are the policies and practices that are in place by the administration actually going to change those circumstances and conditions? Right.
Mhm.
Even at Howard University, there is an encampment. And you, as a graduate of Howard University, you know that there has been a history of encampments and young people occupying spaces at Howard University. And so I think that this is an issue that is resonating at our HBCUs and with our Black students, because when they are seeing what is happening when it comes to foreign policy, they are resonating with those who are oppressed. They are resonating with the Palestinian people. They're resonating with the young people who are being impacted by this war. And so they are demanding more of this administration to act, if they want their vote, if they want them to turn out, if they want them to continue to stay engaged with this policy and these practices, right? As I go and talk to young people at different campuses, consistently, asked about why young people are distrustful of the electoral process. And within my history as a millennial, I've seen elections be stolen. I've seen politicians lie, cheat, and steal. And so part of what needs to happen is that electoral politics really needs a rebrand. It needs to be able to follow through on its promises and policies that they are telling and engaging young people on.
I like to. We talked about new areas such as environmental service, water, climate change, and so forth. I want to put out something on the table that is different, not new, but at least has different possibilities. And it seems to me that at this point, the black middle class in particular, and the black community, have reached a political point. They've reached a political height that allows them not only to consider and begin to think about politics and so forth, but begin to think about the real rationale and the real reason for political involvement and engagement. And that is one's economic interest. Because at the end of the day, that's what politics is about. Will my economic interests be served? Will the kind of resources I need be brought to my community? And one of the things that is really important that I think young people might consider, and it may seem very strange that someone would say this to them, is that one of the most important revolutionary things that they could be doing today is reading and understanding budgets, beginning to understand where the resources of the state, where the resources of the county, where the resources of the city, where the resources of the nation will go. So my sense then becomes, okay, so given that the whole moving to the economic side of the discussion and using our political weight to begin to understand that, what kind of conversations, what kind of reactions you would begin to get if you said to some of the students, one of the most, you have the time and energy, and one of the most revolutionary things you could be doing at this point is reading and understanding budgets.
I absolutely agree, Courtland. I think the number one thing that we try to tell our leaders is to understand your campus budgets, right? When this whole thing came up around, what are we going to say around this war? Some of the things I really urge my young people to think about is that every college campus in America has a budget that is connected to this war, right? How are you working on your college campus to divest and understand that? When we're talking about police brutality, right? In the wake of 2020, we saw universities take action to remove police from campuses and remove external or extra resources that were funneled into police budgets into alternative solutions or more supports for students. And so I agree wholeheartedly, Portland, that like the best thing that these young people can do can understand these budgets and find out ways to divest, right? Even when I was a student in college, a part of the African Black Coalition, we had a campaign successfully to get the University of California system to divest from Wells Fargo. And this is before all of the exposure around the predatory loan practices and the history of Wells Fargo in connection to chattel slavery, all came out. And that was a really critical point in time for us because we understood that this was bigger than just one campus, but this was an entire system that was dedicated to this. And so that was one of the best things I could learn as a young organizer and activist. And I definitely want to implore other young people to do the same.
I'd like to move the discussion a little beyond. I mean, beyond the budget. The budget issue is protests, but a budget issue is power. That is to say, I mean, so it seems to me we have in the black community, I mean, a much greater variation. I mean, most black people, when I was coming up, the only way to make money was most black people who had money, they were either selling insurance or funeral directors. I mean, that was the pathway that you had Gaston in Birmingham. He had a hotel. You had Johnny Johnson, who did uh, the the Ebony and Jet. You had another Johnson who did Ultra Sheen. I could name Spalding who would did Cell Insurance. I could just name them, right? I mean, they were so few. Now we have not only people who have a little bit of money, we have people who are billionaires who are black and engaged in various activities. But as we even look at the billionaires and we talk about them, there are lots of people in our community who can't feed themselves, who don't have enough food. The housing is horrible. I mean, the reason that you have the police system is the police system is geared in the black community, the law and order, as opposed to protect and serve. So how do we now begin to think about using the financial resources to give the poorest people in the community the kind of food, shelter, and housing that is necessary, the taxes that we pay for that, and how do we now begin to help to empower them? See, because my sense is I think we need to go beyond saying those people should not. I think we need to start talking about what should we be doing, how do we organize to do it so that it is now our responsibility to now say if the budget is $1 billion, we want $200 million to go in this direction, as opposed to building a ball stadium, as opposed to building, various playing for various developers and so forth. We need people who need these resources to be funded. So how do we now begin to have the conversations at the college level and with young people to say, how do we now bring the resources to our community? So not to try to correct what they're doing, but how do we now, whatever they're doing, how do we bring the resources to our community to make it much more powerful than it is? Mari, you have any views on that?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, as you were speaking in terms of like how do we organize and how do we mobilize in order to make sure that our actions are similar or actions are in support of the community as a whole, I think it takes us ensuring that resources and conversations and coalitions are built on these campuses. I think some people are acting in terms of silos versus coming together as a collective group. Yes, we're outraged at what's happening. Yes, individuals are active, but if people came together to build a coalition to actually build those proposals, then there could be actual change to put forth that effort. We talked about pushing universities to divest their money within this area, but you can also build those proposals to support them within this area. So building those proposals, those conversations is more than just those actions. I think the follow-up piece of it is also what are your proposals to the universities? What are your collective thoughts? How do you build that coalition to make sure everyone signed on? But also, how do you push that effort in terms of ensuring that there's one collective thought, there's one collective proposal at the end of this, so that you all have an end result from these protests? Yes, the activation support and help, but also we, as we know from the press, we also have to have that paperwork to push forth, or that policy that we actually want to see within the college campuses to actually see that change.
I want to go back to something, Amari, you said earlier, and both Wisdom, you guys spent the last 3 days this weekend with about, you said 31 leaders. And one of the things that I know, because we were involved when we talk about it, is that the NAACP is trying to get 300,000 volunteers to help work the polls to be engaged in this 2024 election. You said that, in fact, that as you try to get these 31 leaders, they were, the hill was kind of steep. And my sense is, given the steepness of that hill, what are some of the strategies that you think you'll be engaged in order to make that hill less steep, and how other people who are listening, who want to involve themselves, particularly young people, can become involved in this whole effort to get 300,000 volunteers?
It goes back to grassroots organizing. We have seen that there is a difference between organizers that on campuses. A lot of things are digital, or there's an email or Instagram, and we're trying to communicate that that's not the only way to get people, but that's also only a narrow way of actually communicating. You actually have to get on the ground and talk to people. You have to walk with them to class. If they're ignoring you, okay, let's have a conversation about your shoes, and let's translate that to, oh, did you? I saw these at the voting poll. Like, making sure that we're sandwiching the messaging properly, but also ensuring that they have the proper training on how do we get back to the ground and have those conversations. Um, I kind of learned that this gap was present doing the work in Georgia. They weren't used to tabling. They weren't used to door knocking. Someone hadn't brought that to their attention, or they had never experienced it. So it was really going back to, how do we go back to square one in terms of how do we get people to the polls? How do we have those conversations? But how do we get back on the ground so individuals see our faces, so they see that we're present, but also we're actually pulling them physically to make sure that they're taking that action. That gap has been significant, especially when it came to conversations with our youth on how exactly are you getting your volunteers. We found that they were in group meetings, that they were in email chains, but how many of you actually tabled? And the remedy to that, or how we kind of fixed that, was we actually had 2 sessions at our Fired Up Summit, to where we actually talked about the recruitment piece, but we also did scenarios and actually helping supporting them, understanding, yes, you're going to have some no's, yes, you're going to have some yeses, yes, you're going to have to sway some individuals, or not sway, but they're going to be neutral. So your goal is to make sure that you're actually having that conversation so that they understand their actions, that actually move forward. But overall, it's about training and ensuring that we are providing them the resources on how do we get back to the ground, because that piece has been a disconnect.
Yeah, Wisdom, you know, Amari just talked about how we get back to the ground. I'm a firm believer in being the ground. That was SNCC. We lived in the communities. We worked. We ate what they ate. We faced whatever they faced. If we had to pump water in the morning outside the pump, there were no heat. We lived in there. But given all the tugs, so we know that being on the ground is key. But given the tugs about digital world that Amari mentioned, and people that pull the whole, I know you're on the road traveling all the time. How do you? We just stayed. We lived in the community. We didn't have to be, in Chicago this morning and Detroit the next minute and so forth, or the digital pull. How is there a way to try to get back to what Amari's talking about? Is there a sense of how we try to get to that?
Yeah, I think the movement needs more organizers, right? We were talking earlier about how we have more activists than ever, but just posting stuff on social media doesn't make you an activist. We know that likes don't equal votes. Part of what we have to do, and I did a lot of thinking around this during the pandemic, because I remember, in 2020, I was in charge of our youth and college civic engagement program. And I created this phenomenal plan around a Campus Plus program where young people would use the resources on campus, not only to turn out young Black people on their campus, but also in the community, right? There were going to be buses and mobilizations, and they were going to canvass their community to also get folks who were low propensity voters. And then when the pandemic hit, it was like, what are we going to do? Like, we can't go outside, we can't connect, we don't know what's going on. And that's when we started doing a lot of the digital organizing and digital canvassing, and a lot of those SMS efforts and email efforts and things of that nature. As we are coming out of this pandemic, I think that we have to take the tools and tactics that we learned over this last 4 years and marry it with some of the tried and true practices that we've seen before. Right? We have to be tabling, we have to be doing class wraps, we have to be engaging in community, we have to be convening people to understand their why. We have to be doing listening sessions where folks are able to engage in transformational dialogue, but not forget the tools and tactics that we've built over the course of the last 4 years, right? I think that there is a world and a space where both of them can exist together. And part of our jobs as organizers, as leaders in the movements, as folks who've experienced this before, is to be able to give young people that opportunity and space to engage with some of those tried and true practices and marry the two together.
You know, so Wisdom, let me ask you a question. As you talk to these young people, what percentage of them have the long view? I mean, a lot of people, when you, well, the good thing about young people is that they have energy. They have beliefs. They have a sense that, things ought to be right. They were taught this and they were taught that, and these are the things that we're for. And they believe with their time and energy that things will be done and settled in 6 months, maybe a year. And so it doesn't happen that way. So how do you what do you tell young people as they try to get out there to deal with the various issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's police brutality, whether it's loans and student debt and so forth? I mean, you begin to the attrition rate is probably high because the frustration rate is high. I mean, how do you now begin to think and talk to these young people and telling that this is a long view? I mean, having been out here for 64 years, I know it's a long view. So the question then becomes, how do you now begin, or is there a way that you've developed to tell people, these young people, that it's a long view and that each action they take is helpful, but it's not going to bring the solution?
Yeah, it's real examples of how folks have been consistently building power in a compounding effect, right? I think oftentimes as young leaders, right, we are able to mobilize like no other, right? I believe this generation is probably one of the best mobilizing generations that I've seen in a long time, where they are able to move and get things done in an instant. But we, as organizers, we know that power is built over time. And so part of what I like to do is really make sure that they have real world examples of how that's been seen, right? Coming from the Bay Area, there is a deep history of the Black Panther Party, and even understanding how the free breakfast program came to be, right? And what was needed to do that. Even the reason of like why we protest, right? Like protest isn't just us going out in the street and making some noise, but it's stopping business as usual. But it can't stop there, right? It has to go from the protest to the polls. It has to be a consistently evolving situation, right? Even in this student debt cancellation fight, this campaign has been happening for over 20 years, longer than I've even had student debt, right? I think it's very important for us to understand the history of those movements. I really believe in the principle and concept of Sankofa, right? For us to move forward, we have to look back. And when we're seeing this attack on diversity, equity, inclusion, when we're seeing this attack on book bans, when we're seeing this attack on critical race theory and all of these ideas, we are seeing less and less education in our schools. There is a purposeful effort to make sure that young people don't know about these movements. They don't know about the history of where they came from. And so I think it's very important for us to be able to provide that knowledge and understanding of how we have done things in terms of the long scheme of the movement, and giving them as a roadmap so they can build that course forward for the present time.
Amari, so I want to kind of ask you the same question in a different way. So you talk to a lot of young people in 2022. This is 2024. Where do you think their heads are at?
I would say the hope that we built in 2022 it's been shaken. I think they have a distrust. We got them to get out to vote, and every year there's an increase in youth turnout in terms of it. But we have to look at the demographics. Every year, I think I know Wisdom has numbers better, but this year we are expecting a huge influx of 18-year-olds who are not going to be able to vote. But I think where it happens is there's distrust. So we have to go back to square one, talk about the issues, talk about how do we connect it to the democracy, how like it's back to literal square one to build that trust back, but also to build that agency back. So we understand that you didn't get what we expected, but we have seen some increases or we have seen some adjustments. So how exactly do we mobilize and motivate you to ensure that you still have action within this election? There is no way for us to have them or to not allow them, but there is no way for us to sit back and just say it's okay for you not to be active within this election. It's important for us to go back to square one, talk about the issues, and motivate them to ensure that we talk about how exactly do we maintain democracy. I think in 2022 we talked about how do we save it. Now it's more so like how do we continue the understanding of what your agency is and what your power is, and how do we motivate you to continue to exercise your agency and power, even though things may not be what exactly we expected to see. There are going to be some shifts and pivots, but there should never be a time where you actually lay down and not provide or utilize your tools in terms of where your voice can be heard, or that sense of accountability for individuals, or the sense of accountability when it comes to what issues individuals are impacting. But I think it goes back to understanding we have to go back to square one. We're not where we were in 2022. There is a lot of distrust. How do we actually build and navigate and support individuals as they are navigating through that distrust?
So,
And I want
so
to,
I'd like
if I
to
can
you go ahead, go, Wisdom.
like at Courtland, something about this generation right now, right? 4 years ago, when all those young people were going into college, right? And 2020, that was also a pandemic year, right? And so many of them didn't have a high school graduation. Many of them didn't have a prom. Many of them didn't get to experience homecoming. Many of them have been online for school for quite some time. And then now 4 years later, where we're seeing young people rise up and protest, we're seeing college graduations get canceled. We're seeing divisiveness happen amongst young people in that space, right? That's the same group of people who 4 years ago didn't have that opportunity. And so as they're graduating into the real world, this is their understanding of life. This is their understanding of what happens when you build power. And so there has to be some deep work to restore that trust, to show them that their efforts weren't in vain, and that what they want to build or the world they want to see has an actual hope in a future. And I wholeheartedly believe that young people deserve a new deal, right? There has to be a real deal that is economic, that addresses climate justice, that addresses education, that gives them a real hope, not for themselves, but for their younger siblings, for their peers, for the people that they care about.
So, Wisdom, you went to PWIs. Am I correct?
I
And,
did.
and PWI is a what? Principally white institution.
Yes, sir.
And Amari, you attended HBCU, right?
The
You
number one.
attended Spelman.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So as you try
Indeed.
to organize in the two environments, PWIs or HBCU, what do you see as what are any different experiences as you try to talk to the young black people in those different circumstances? I mean, what do you see as the difference? What are the similarities?
As someone who helped organize on the HBCU campuses and also PWIs, in terms of resource and education for Black communities on PWIs, we have to create that culture. Some of the campuses are missing it. Yes, BSU is present, yes, but when it comes to the educational piece or the empowerment piece, it's gone, or it's not present. For me, coming from Spelman, where we had when we all vote on campus, Michelle Obama came and talked to us about the importance of vote. Like we had culture on our campuses that reflected, Black and brown people who were within the movement, who empowered us to get out to vote. Like these things were present for us. Then I go to the PWIs. I didn't see that culture connection to the election as much. For us, it's a culture. Our HBCUs are building a culture of voting. It is actually we are not celebrating, but we're actually pushing forth the celebration to show people when you use your agency, this is what happens. We went to the PWIs, it wasn't there as much. Like they were actually even timid to even come up to the table. So they were like, we, never experienced anything like this. You mean we bring DJs who are playing music that they, are engaging with. We're bringing photo booths. We're bringing things to them that HBCU experience, and we're empowering them to get out to vote. Some of them had never seen that before. And we had a student actually from Indiana State who was a part of the Fired Up Summit. And he was like, this is my first time seeing our people talking about these issues. Like on campus, it's not necessarily a safe space for us, or it's not necessarily a space for us to talk about the election or talk about the issues that are on the ballot that impact us, or actually talk about, what is bothering us when it comes to upcoming election. That space was not present. So we actually provided that space for them. I know different demographics, different states have, different cultures. PWIs in Georgia and Indiana are not going to be the same that are in California, because from what I know, California cranks out a robust amount of individuals who are actually organizers. But many of the other states, that's not necessarily present. That sense of how do I tie culture and community and voting and actions and activations is not something that is always present on those campuses, or that's not necessarily pushed for. Like for us, it was led by our president. It was led by our staff. It wasn't necessarily just the students. It was overall, we understood as African Americans, we understood as Black and brown people, why things are in stake for us and what's the difference between us and other communities, and why we have to make sure that the campus is a sacred space to make sure that leaders are actually getting out to vote.
Yeah.
Wisdom. You want to say anything on behalf of the PWIs?
Yeah, look, Amari, she's absolutely right, right? Like a lot of what we're doing at PWIs is building culture, right? Because a lot of times the way the PWIs are designed are actually to keep Black students separate and not building power, right? I remember going to UC Santa Cruz and being like one of 5 Black students in my intro freshman chemistry class, right? And somebody leaning over to me and saying, "Hey, African American Studies is in the other room," right? And so you're constantly facing microaggressions. You're constantly facing this perspective of being a Black face in a sea of white faces, right? It's more advantageous for you sometimes to keep a low profile, to not let your Blackness show, to integrate into the culture versus to create it yourself. And so, particularly at PWIs, you have to be intentional about creating that culture. When I was on campus for our BSU, we had a rule that every single executive committee member had to bring a new student to the BSU meeting. Every time I was on campus, anytime I saw a Black student, I would stop them and say, "Hey, my name is Wisdom Cole. I'm with the BSU. If there's anything going on, feel free to contact me, hit me up. We meet Thursdays. We get some food first, and then we go to the meeting." Creating those spaces. Like we had to fight to create a African American resource center. We had to fight to create an African American themed housing that actually was filled with young Black people. And to Amari's point around, even the professor engagement, right? Young professors who are in those spaces, particularly Black professors, oftentimes don't have the support, and we're turning to them and asking them for help, and they don't have the support themselves, and so we got to organize them too. And so, so part of what we have to do in building culture is recognize the disadvantages that PWI students may have. But what is there, and this is what we did in California, is really work to build statewide Black student organizations, right? The African Black Coalition, the largest Black student collegiate organization in the state of California, was an avenue in which I grew my organizing because I had the opportunity to talk with Lane Brown. I had the opportunity to engage with Bobby Seale. I had the opportunity to be taught by Professor Angela Davis and to hear about these movements and understand my mission as a Black student organizer, right? Without those people in my life, I wouldn't be where I'm at today, right? And even further, right, understanding the history, right? Every time I've been to HBCUs, these students know the history of their campus. They know how it came to be. They knew why they're here. They know why it's so important to have that pride, right? And you're seeing right now, like even these PWIs are like, "Hey, let's do this homecoming culture. Let's bring it back." And it's like, it's not the same. It's a different type of energy. And so I think it's really important for us to be able to provide those accesses and resources for young people. You're even seeing this in California, right? They're working to build an HBCU out in California or increase HBCU pride in California. And I think that's a noble effort, but I think it has to be strategic in a way that allows young people to also be a part of that process in building and creating.
I think the point that you've made, both Amari and the question of culture, and I think I was highly privileged uh, because we had Sterling Brown at Howard University, and he would come to the dormitory and he would give us a lesson in the blues. And next week we'd come and talk about jazz, and then he'd come and talk about poetry, and he'd invite us over his house to talk about Du Bois and all the other leaders, Monroe Trotter and all the other leaders that he knew and so forth. So the kind of nurturing is very important. But the dilemma is that is not as valued as the imagery of I attended X, I attended Columbia, I attended this, I attended that. And so my sense is part of the conversation we have to have, and you and not I mean I was about to say is we have to have as young people, but you have to have as young people, is what is valued. What are the things that are valued? Because it's really important about who gets to define. It's really important about whose value system is recognized. And so I think just as you have this conversation about the importance of HBCUs and environments where we can strengthen our own culture and strengthen our own view of ourselves and strengthen our own importance, I think as part of the conversations you have as youth in college is that whether and you're doing it at this point, whether you're in the HBCU, which was a natural environment, or in a PWI, the kind of strengthening of culture, this kind of strengthening of individual worth, because that is important, because you can't strive to be like them and be strong, because
Yeah.
you'll never be them. You'll always be second class. And one of the things that's really important is that when you really look at the leaders who've been strong in the United States and made the difference, most of them came out of HBCUs because that is the kind of culture you guys just talked about. So over the next year, uh, what do you see? What is your work between now and November 2024?
Yeah, I think young people are looking for authentic experiences, right? Or even see, I just read this article about how young people are saying no to Columbia University because they're seeing that this university isn't aligned with their morals, principles, and values, right? Over I think just really over the last 5 years to the last decade, HBCUs has really entered into the mainstream dialogue where young people are talking about I'm going to go play in an HBCU versus play at a big Pac-10 school. And so I love that the dialogue and discourse is happening. But I think that it's really important that we marry that dialogue with our purpose and our duty, right? There are young people, even this last month when I was going around the country, who are saying that they're not going to vote. And recognizing that they don't want to engage in this process that for them hasn't served its purpose. And so part of it is recognizing and reminding them that there are so many impacts and so many consequences to not turning out. That there are things that happen all the way up and down the ballot that we have to be engaged in, right? Your district attorney impacts you the very next day. These ballot initiatives that pass from the local to the state level impact you the very next day. It's important for us to make sure that we are engaged and recognizing that civic engagement isn't just on November 5th on election day, but it really is a 365-day of the year job. And I really honestly believe that our educational system has done a poor job of emphasizing that or making that known to our young people. And so part of what we're doing is combating that narrative and providing them with real tangible resources to show how their activism and their protests can actually be exemplified through voter turnout. And so we are all in on making sure that young people recognize their power. We're all in on making sure that young people turn out. We're all in on mobilization, right? Now, there's going to be a lot of narratives about young people not turning out, young people being lethargic, with young people not caring. And we have to counter that by showing that there are amazing young Black leaders across the nation, from Kentucky to Indiana to Nevada, Arizona, all across the country. Some of these young people who were with us this weekend, who care about the future of this country.
So Amari and Wisdom, I want to thank you for the invitation you gave me to come and speak to the youth leadership on last weekend. And as both of you said, that we have a fundamental belief that this is a relationship that is long going, because we know that you are our inheritors. You are the people who will carry forward. So as 2024 go on, in 2025, 26, whatever, we're always here to have that discussion, always there to answer any questions or any that you have, so that, I look forward to continue the dialogue and discussion that we've been having. I appreciate both of you joining me today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Courtland.
All right.
Thank you for having us.
For full biographies, additional resources, and B-roll clips, visit our website at www.snclegacyproject.org.